Christopher Columbus discovered the Americas. Millions died in pursuit of conquering this unknown land. The European powers of the time took part in colonization, and the centuries after witnessed remarkable wars and a new age of influence. These events lead to the birth of a new nation. On July 4, 1776, the United States of America. Since the USA has conquered the world in every aspect possible. The most powerful military in modern history, to countless astonishing human accomplishments. The country has earned the name the modern Roman Empire. But can this giant continue its dominance? To understand the story of this fascinating land, we must start from the very beginning. Long before European colonization, the native peoples of North America had developed complex and sophisticated systems of society and government. Hundreds of thousands war, made peace and governed over specific regions, and had done so for thousands of years. By the time the first European explorers began to arrive on the North American continent, in the 5th–10th century, the Native Americans had already established themselves and their communities for thousands of years. The North American continent, vast and rich with natural resources, would beckon all who came to know of its shores. And so when a Norse navigator named Leif Erikson learned that there was a land west of Greenland from fellow explorer Bjorn Heriolsen, he made preparations to set sail. Heriolsen, who had been blown off course while sailing, had accidentally discovered what would one day be called Newfoundland. And although he did not land, his story gave Erikson the information he needed to successfully sail across the Labrador Sea and make landfall in North America. Erikson and the Norsemen would establish a small settlement in Labrador called One-So Meadows or Meadows Cove. This settlement and numerous small outposts built nearby it would be abandoned over the course of about 20 years. Afterward, it would be nearly another 500 years before Europeans set foot on the shores of North America. Searching for a more direct and faster route to India, the great European powers of the age sent dozens of expeditions around the globe. In October 1492, the Genoese explorer Christopher Columbus, employed by the King and Queen of Spain, discovered the West Indies and inadvertently opened a new frontier of exploration. Popularized as the New World by Florentine explorer Amerigo Vespucci, it was open season for European explorers, traders and businessmen alike. European powers began claiming sections of this new world as their own. With every major exploratory mission, Vespucci, who created and sold maps of his own discoveries in the New World, gained the notable distinction of having the entire hemisphere named for him America. While much of the early exploration of the New World focused on what would become known as the Caribbean and South America, it did not take long before explorers turned their attention north to the enormous landmass above Columbus's Hispaniola. At the dawn of the 16th century, the Spanish, English, Portuguese, Swedish, Dutch, and French all entered a race to explore and map the entire east coast of North America. In 1497, Italian explorer Giovanni Caboto, known as John Cabot by his English employers, discovered the same region of Newfoundland that Leif Erikson and the Vikings had settled. Nearly 500 years earlier, Cabot's discoveries credited him as the discoverer of the North American continent, as no record of Erikson's expedition or settlement had yet been discovered to the south. Expeditions by Juan Ponce de Leon, Alvar Núñez Quebica de Vaca, and Hernando de Soto would map Florida and the American Southeast. As Spain prepared to establish permanent colonies in the New World. Likewise to the north, Jacques Cartier explored the St. Lawrence River, while Giovanni de Verrazzano mapped much of the east coast for France. All along the coast, the Europeans encountered the numerous tribes of Native Americans. Early interactions ranged from welcoming to violent, as cultures from separate hemispheres met for the first time, as it had in the Caribbean and South America. First contact introduced these cultures to each other, with the sharing of gifts and trading of information. Naturally, these meetings exposed Native Americans to European diseases and caused widespread illness and death. The first attempts to make permanent settlements in the New World began in the mid-16th century, with varying degrees of success. Surviving in the New World was not an easy task, and establishing a permanent settlement proved to be exceptionally challenging. In 1585, the English attempted to establish a permanent colony on Roanoke Island, off the coast of what is today North Carolina. The journey across the Atlantic was brutal and left the colonists with few supplies. When they arrived, making contact with the local Aquas, Kogoguk, Pamela, and Secondin tribes. The colonists, many of whom were military personnel, became embroiled in an argument with the Aquas Kogoguk and burned their village to the ground. Meetings with the Sikhodin went considerably better, outfitting the colonists with enough food to survive a miserable winter. Smallpox and influenza epidemics ran through every native village who encountered the colonists. Communication broke down and violence finally convinced the colonists to move on, abandoning the colony, arriving in 1587. A year after the first attempt to settle Roanoke failed. Colonists, largely made up of middle-class Londoners with no military experience, landed on Croatoan Island and began to establish a settlement some 40 miles south of the first failed settlement. The colony suffered great difficulty surviving. In 1588, a relief mission to the colony was looted by Spanish naval vessels operating off the coast, leaving its new location unknown to English authorities. That same year, Spanish vessels sailed near Croatoan Island and found that it appeared abandoned. The next relief mission to the colony finally arrived in 1590 and found smoke rising from both Croatoan Island and Roanoke Island. A landing party discovered both settlements. Abandoned and sacked, the only clues were the letters C, R-O, carved into a tree, and the word Croatoan, carved into one of the posts of a palisade, allegedly built by the settlers of the colony. Known as the Lost Colony, the settlers of Roanoke were never discovered. The colony deemed lost by the English government. In 1564, a group of French Huguenot settlers attempted to start a colony in what would become St. Augustine, Florida, only to have the colony sacked and all of its male citizens killed by rival Spanish forces. The settlement established by the Spanish colonists at St. Augustine is considered the first permanent European settlement in North America. In 1607, the English attempted again to establish a permanent colony in the New World. Led by the London Company, the settlement aimed to establish a colony in Virginia and selected a marshy region on the James River, which they christened Jamestown. The colony did well initially, quickly constructing living and meeting space, as well as a palisade fort. Relations with the local Powhatan tribes began with hostilities, but gradually cooled over time as the settlers and native peoples of the region learned to cohabitate. The Powhatan offered food and friendship to the colonists, who took the opportunity to search the surrounding region for gold and other precious metals. Instead, they found that the swampy region that they had inhabited held no riches, but disease. The people of Jamestown suffered from lack of coordination, disease, and the harshness of the environment around them. Despite the aid of the Powhatan people, it was only when Captain John Smith took command of the colony and in near dictation tutorial fashion reorganized their efforts to establish trade with the natives and plant crops of their own in and around the colony. To England, not long after his term as leader of the colony, but he had established a path for the colonists to follow that allowed Jamestown to endure difficult years of famine and struggle. Jamestown survived, and by the mid-17th century was thriving as more settlements began to grow around her. Jamestown has the distinction of being the first English settlement to survive in the New World. In 1619, 12 years after the colony's founding, Jamestown became the site of yet another first. When the first African slaves arrived in Virginia, 20 to 30 enslaved Africans who had been captured by English privateers from a Spanish slave ship were brought to Point Comfort, Virginia. From there, a number were sold or traded to the settlement at Jamestown. Slavery had existed in the New World since the mid-16th century, but this moment marked the beginning of 2.5 centuries of slavery in what would become the United States. The English continued their colonial settlement in 1620 with the establishing of the Puritan colony at Plymouth, Massachusetts. Unlike the financially motivated London Company at Jamestown, the Puritan colonists at Plymouth, known as Pilgrims, had come to America in search of religious freedom. They voyaged across the Atlantic in the Mayflower, suffering months of terrible weather at sea. When they arrived in the New World, they first landed near what would become known as Provincetown. There the colonists, concerned over their rights to the land and their legal right to establish a colony, drafted and signed the Mayflower Compact, establishing their right to self-govern while still holding allegiance to the English crown. However, without finding a reasonable place to begin building their settlement, and after a brief but violent encounter with a local tribe, the Puritans found Provincetown unfit and sailed up the coast for better ground. At last they decided on Plymouth Harbor, building upon an abandoned Patuxent settlement as a base for their new home, settled between two hills, on which the colonists built two forts. The colony at Plymouth initially struggled through a difficult winter, living aboard the Mayflower and building their settlement by day. In March 1621, they made first contact with the Wampanoag. The Wampanoag chief Massasoit was hesitant to trust the Pilgrims. Also uncertain of the Puritans was Squanto, a Patuxent native who had been taken in by the Wampanoag. Squanto, or Tisquantum, spoke English and had spent time in Europe after he'd been kidnapped by an English explorer. In 1614, he had returned to America with another explorer, whose party was ambushed and massacred by Massasoit, and his tribe working as an interpreter. Squanto helped the Puritans and the Wampanoag reach an agreement of non-aggression. In the fall of 1621, the Pilgrims celebrated what has become known as the First Thanksgiving. Along with Chief Massasoit and several of his men, the celebration lasted for 3 days, and both parties procured and presented various dishes of local game. Like Jamestown, Plymouth was well run, and its early success was built upon by enterprising companies and individuals in England. More and more companies began crossing the Atlantic and established new settlements. Throughout the 17th century, the English began spreading as more colonies were formed and amalgamated with their fellow English neighbors. The Massachusetts Bay Colony, for example, would absorb the Plymouth Colony and others. As it grew in size, as these settlements became more established, trade opened with Europe and goods. Money and more colonists poured into the New World. Not to be outdone, other European powers attempted to create their own permanent settlements as they grabbed more and more of the coastal region for themselves. What started as small settlements along coastal waters soon became large swaths of territory claimed in the name of kings and queens from far-off European nations. In 1614, the Dutch West India Company began to establish permanent settlements in the Northeast, around what would one day become New York and New Jersey's small settlements, and fur trading outposts on Governor's Island and along the Hudson and East Rivers marked what was called New Netherlands. In 1624, fearing military incursions from other European powers, they purchased the island of Manhattan from the Munsee Lenape tribe for $24 and constructed Fort Amsterdam at the southern tip of the island. The settlement, which grew within and alongside the fort, was called New Amsterdam. The settlement utilized its unique environment to expand trade and use hydropower to enhance its growth. New Amsterdam was a city of trade and commerce in its earliest form, and always would be. It was a tempting target for the English, who wanted control of the Hudson for themselves. In 1664, 4 English frigates sailed into the harbor of New Amsterdam and ordered the Dutch to surrender the city. They did so bloodlessly, although the event did spark the Second Anglo-Dutch War. In June 1665, New Amsterdam was reincorporated under English law and renamed New York City. Spain, whose early discovery of the New World gave them an advantage in colonizing South America, and the Caribbean began settling in what would become the American Southeast. From their earliest settlement in St. Augustine, the Spanish traveled inward toward their territorial conquests in Mexico and upward toward Canada, carving a path through the center of the North American continent. By the end of the 17th century, Spain's North American empire would cover much of the Deep South, Midwest and western portions of the continent. France, England's longtime rival and chief competitor in North America, set their sights for permanent settlement along the St. Lawrence River, still hoping for an easy path to the Pacific. The settlements to Dezique, Quebec to All Rivers, and Montreal followed the winding St. Lawrence. Further and further inland, France established firm control of the fur trade in the region, then began to extend its influence further down the Mississippi River. In the Gulf, the French established a settlement along the bank of the Mississippi called Nouvelle Orleans, or New Orleans. New Orleans was established in 1718 and was the gateway to the Mississippi, a crown jewel in France's North American empire. As the 18th century began, the numerous settlements continued to grow as Europe carved up great swaths of North America. For their own, these colonial territories were defined by various treaties and agreements between the colonizing nations, often ignoring the already existing native population and the complex relationships which already existed in North America. Many Native Americans fought back, acting as opportunists. Tribes worked with and against European settlers, often sparking conflict. Raids on settlements were not uncommon, and the colonists could not always rely on their far-flung colonial protectors if these actions required a serious defense. One of the largest and most violent of these was King Philip's War. In 1675, in the colony of New England, war broke out after a significant failure of diplomacy between the colonists and the Wampanoag tribe and their allies. Metacom, son of Massasoit, who had aided the Pilgrims at Plymouth Colony, had become the Grand Sachem of the Wampanoag Confederacy and did not have the same tolerance for the settlers, as his father had disagreements over livestock, intrusion on Wampanoag land, and the presence of colonial missionaries attempting to convert natives to Christianity was the last straw for Metacom, who, unlike his father, saw only danger in the existence of these settlers on their land. An alliance of Algonquin tribes led by Metacom. It struck at not only New England, but the larger, more established towns as well. With no English soldiers stationed in the colonies, the New England militia mobilized to defend their homes. The militia targeted native villages, knowing that it would enrage and damage the Indians' ability to wage war. Metacom was killed in 1676. Just a year into the war, his death spelled doom for the Wampanoag and their Narragansett allies. With no one guiding the conflict, things quickly turned in the favor of the New England militia, who all but destroyed the Wampanoag people and forced their allies out of the New England territory. It was the bloodiest conflict in North America to date. In the wake of King Philip's War, tension between the English colonists and their French and Dutch neighbors grew high in the Northeast. 5 native tribes, located north of the New England colony, formed the Wabanaki Confederation after witnessing the demise of their southern Wampanoag neighbors in King Philip's War, increasing tensions with the English colonists. In 1689, just 2 years after King Philip's War had ended, the colonists were at war again, this time at the behest of their mother countries. Fighting broke out as the English-backed Iroquois tribes attacked French settlements, and the French-backed Wabanaki attacked English ones. As French and English soldiers made their way to the New World, the colonists of New England and New France prepared to fight each other, known as King William's War. The conflict dragged on for nearly a decade and saw French successes in the colony of New York and English successes in Acadia, later known as Nova Scotia, and along the St. Lawrence River. Neither side was able to take their main goal. For the French, Boston; for the English, Quebec. And the war concluded in 1697. But King William's War was only the beginning. It was the first of 4 major conflicts between France and England, which pitted their various native allies against one another, and peace was not kept for long. In 1701, King Charles II, the last Habsburg king of Spain, died with no direct heir. in a confusing web of potential replacements, bound by secret treaties and backroom agreements. English, Austrian, Prussian, and Dutch powers scrambled to stop the French from taking control of the Spanish throne, known as the War of Spanish Succession, or Queen Anne's War in North America. The conflict originated in Europe and did not take long for the fighting to come to the shores of North America in the south. Spanish Florida and French colonists in Louisiana were engaged by English colonists from the province of Carolina. The fighting decimated the native populations of the region and helped secure English control of Georgia. In New England, the Wabanaki again sided with the French, and continuous raids on new English settlements plagued the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Concerted efforts made by the English military once again failed to capture Quebec City, but made considerable gains in Acadia. The fighting in North America had little effect on the war's ultimate outcome. In Europe, but more than 13 years of continuous fighting wreaked havoc throughout North America, permanently damaging native and colonial communities alike. In the end, the French would give away vital territory to the English, including the Hudson River Valley, Acadia, and Newfoundland. These concessions did not include the various native tribes engaged on either side of the war and set the stage for future conflicts. For nearly 3 decades, there was relative peace between the major European powers. In North America in this time, the colonies grew larger and more complex, forming their own colonial governments and expanding a new and thriving North American economy of agriculture, textile production, and maritime trade. As the value of the North American colonies grew, it did, alongside her South American and Caribbean neighbors. Valuable gold and silver had been found in South America, and the Caribbean produced commodities which were by now a necessity in Europe and North America, namely molasses and other sugar products. The production of these commodities, of course, was powered by the sweat of slave labor. By now, the American colonies were all in, engaged in what was known as the Triangle Trade. Slaves from Africa were brought to the Americas, where these slave ships would deposit African slaves for sale and take on cargo of sugar bound for New England. These ships would then sell the sugar and slaves and take on rum, tobacco, cotton, and other goods, and return to Africa to trade them for slaves. On and on it went, an ever more valuable and grotesque sale of human lives. Slavery was rampant in the Caribbean and South America, and grew rapidly in North American colonies as well. From the first years of North American colonization, in the early 1600s to the mid-18th century, the number of slaves imported to the Americas had increased from roughly 300,000 from 1625 to more than 2 million from 1751 to 1775. The increased value of the Americas led directly to the Third of the Indian Wars, Like Queen Anne's War before it, the conflict began well outside of North America. Distrustful of the Spanish control of the South American market, the British were displeased by the mercantile stranglehold Spain had over trade to South America, and the Caribbean likewise. The Spanish were displeased with British encroachment in North America on what they believed was their territory north of Florida after the 1721 founding of the colony of Georgia. Following Queen Anne's War, the Spanish were convinced that the British had designs on removing them from Florida. Spanish vessels began boarding British trading ships, searching for contraband. While this action was legal due to past treaties, the boardings resulted in increased tensions between the two powers. In 1731, the British brig Rebecca was stopped off the coast of Cuba and boarded for inspection of contraband cargo. On board, the Spanish officials found an illegal cargo of sugar. Rebecca's captain, a man named Robert Jenkins, alleged that during the search, he had been tortured by the Spanish officials and had had his ear partially cut off. While the Royal Navy would admit that Jenkins was at fault for carrying illegal cargo, his story, told before the Houses of Parliament in England, struck a nerve in 1739. The British found that, among other reasons, the Spanish were guilty of depredations upon British subjects and commenced war against the Spanish in the Americas. Known as the War of Jenkins' Ear, the conflict saw little action on North American shores, but the bulk of the fighting occurring in South America and the Caribbean, as the British Navy attempted to capture and claim multiple Spanish forts and port towns. Fighting between the British colonists in the Carolinas, in Georgia, and the Spanish colonists in Florida came to little fruit for either side, and again, only appeared to do the worst harm to the local Indian tribes who fought on either side. In 1742, another war broke out in Europe, this time between Prussia and Austria, over control of Silesia once again. A question of the right of succession brought all of Europe's great powers into war. The death of Emperor Charles VI of Austria had left a power vacuum in Central Europe, with Great Britain, the Dutch Republic, Hanover, and Russia supporting Charles VI's daughter, Maria Theresa, as his heir, and France, Spain, Prussia, and Sweden supporting Charles Albert of Bavaria, who believed he had the right of inheritance. This war, known as King George's War in North America, and the War of Austrian Succession in Europe, swallowed everything in its wake, including the War of Jenkins' Ear. As war raged in Europe, France and England once again turned their attention toward their North American territories. As before, the Wabanaki Confederacy and the Iroquois Confederacy allied themselves with the French and British, hoping to effect some great change for their rapidly shrinking continent. Fighting focused once again over control of Acadia and the St. Lawrence River. In 1745, the British colonists achieved the first substantial gain in the last 50 years of colonial warfare, with the capture of Fortress Louisbourg at the mouth of the St. Lawrence River. Fighting stretched down into the colony of New York, as well as New England. The war took an awful toll on the British colonists, particularly in the final years of fighting. When the war at last came to an end in 1748, the British colonists were forced to return Louisbourg to the French, infuriating the colonists, who had won it at an excessive cost of life. Once again, after years of violence, the borders were returned to their pre-war status, with nothing having been gained. Territorial disputes went unsettled. Grudges continued, and the situation in the North American backcountry was still violent as English colonists, French colonists, and Native American tribes all vied for control of the wilderness. The undefined borders between British and French colonies had long been an issue between the two nations. Yet despite multiple conflicts, no formal agreement had been reached as far as definitively laying out who owned what. It was only a matter of time before war broke out again. In late 1753, the lieutenant governor of the Virginia colony, Robert Dinwiddie, ordered George Washington to remove French colonial troops from forts in the Ohio River Valley. The colony of Virginia claimed this territory as its own and felt that it was within their right to vacate the French from the forts, which still dotted the region from the last century of fighting. The expedition resulted in a French rejection of Virginia's demands, and Washington, who was promoted to lieutenant colonel upon his return, was once again sent into the Ohio River Valley to remove the French from their forts, by force if necessary. In April 1754, French troops learned from their native allies, the Mingos, that a small British fort had been built by colonial militia at the forks of the Ohio River. French troops marched to the fort and captured it. They built in its place a much later fortification, which they named Fort Duquesne. Meanwhile, further south in the valley, Colonel Washington and his small force of colonial militia and natives allied to the English came upon and engaged an encampment of unsuspecting French troops. The French were quickly overwhelmed and later explained that they had been sent to intercept Washington peacefully and to warn him of his apparent incursion in what they believed was French territory. To Washington's surprise, the leader of the native forces, accompanying him to Norristown, attacked and killed the wounded French commander, likely due to a long-standing hatred of the French. Washington feared the French would attack and constructed a small fort, which he named Fort Necessity. Necessity was, as Washington predicted, quickly surrounded by French troops from Duquesne and forced to surrender. This small skirmish set the world on fire. Lieutenant Governor Dinwiddie called for aid from his fellow colonies and from the British government back in England. Fearing that the incursion would strengthen French claims to the region, the British government immediately sent troops to strike at the various French forts still in and around the St. Lawrence River and the Ohio River Valley. The French sent additional forces to North America to hold off the inevitable British invasion. Quite suddenly, France and England were once again at war. Multiple early British forays into the Ohio River Valley and Canada failed spectacularly. Early into the war, it seemed as though the French would be able to secure their holdings in North America and even found success in capturing a number of critical British forts in the colony of New York, including Fort Ticonderoga and Fort William Henry. In 1758, fortunes changed for the English, as the complicated system of entangled alliances produced by the past century of war finally ignited the 7 Years' War. The fighting in the Ohio River Valley, known as the French and Indian War in America, had launched the largest European land war to date, with every major European power of the era engaged. Thousands of naval vessels were activated for duty. Fighting stretched not only across North America, but to Europe, the Caribbean, India, and Asia, as the French were forced to direct their attention to Europe and to other, more valuable parts of their empire. The British were able to take advantage on the North American front, with the British Navy actively keeping the French from not being able to resupply along the St. Lawrence River. British and American colonial forces successfully captured Fort Niagara, Fortress Louisbourg, and the city of Quebec. As the French lost more and more ground, it became clear that the fight for North America was over in 1760. British General Geoffrey Amherst managed to secure a formal surrender from the governor of New France, Pierre-Francois de Ragot, Marquis de Vaudreuil-Cavaignac, and largely ended the hostilities in North America. Meanwhile, the 7 Years' War continued abroad and continued to carve pieces from the Kingdom of France and her allies in 1763. The 7 Years' War officially came to an end, and the French and Indian War with it. Casualties were astronomical for the period, with some estimates reaching as high as 1.4 million. Of that number, the French and Indian War accounted for roughly 23,000 killed, wounded, or captured, just under 2% of the total casualties of the global conflict. For nearly a century, England had beaten back the French, Dutch, and Spanish empires, gradually cementing its claim to the New World. Over the course of the 18th century, the successes of the British Empire during these conflicts had created the ideal condition for their colonies in North America to experience an incredible population boom. From roughly 250,000 in 17 to more than 1.25 million in 1750. The raw materials produced by the American colonies, including hemp, copper, and tar, were necessary for the British Army and Navy to wage war and protect the vastly growing empire. While it was in the interest of the British Empire to defeat the French and secure their North American holdings, it had also been in the colonists' interests. The English colonists had no great love for the French, and anti-Catholic sentiment was a regular part of colonial life, especially in places like New England, which had been staunchly Protestant for the first 2 centuries of its settlement. That the American colonies were made up chiefly of individuals of the Protestant faith was naturally no coincidence. Many Protestant organizations had funded the various colonization efforts through the 17th century and had maintained a lasting impact and presence into the 1700s. However, the strongest impact of Protestantism in the American came during the colonial wars, which dominated the early and mid-18th century. A global religious phenomenon occurred, known as the Great Awakening, gripped both Europe and North America, and brought the Protestant faith to new heights. The Great Awakening was a major evangelical revival, which expanded the Protestant faith throughout Europe and colonial North America. The revival brought about new religious theories and dogma as concepts, such as the nature of salvation and the idea of rebirth, were spread by itinerant preachers who traveled the countryside, giving sermons and lectures as they saw fit. These preachers were tremendous orators and captured captive audiences wherever they went. George Whitefield, a major player in this evangelical movement, traveled across the colonies and preached in major cities and small towns, wherever he could gather a crowd. And gather them he did in October 1740. While preaching in Boston, Massachusetts, Whitefield allegedly drew a crowd of more than 30,000 people from around New England. To put that in perspective, Boston was the highest populated city in colonial North America in 1740, coming in at a roughly 17,000 people living in and around the city. Nearly double the city's population was present to hear Whitefield speak. The movement revived the religious spirit of Christian peoples and reaffirmed their faith through periods of intense conflict and uncertain survival. While the revival did not change governments or raise great armies, as religious revivals had done in the past in Europe, the Great Awakening was formative for many individuals in colonial North America, many of whom would go on to be the founding fathers and mothers of the nation. The 1763 Treaty of Paris saw enormous territorial gains for Great Britain. Vast swaths of formerly French-occupied land were now British colonies, including Canada, all of the Louisiana Territory, east of the Mississippi, and many Caribbean islands. The British colonists in North America were ecstatic, as the land of the West would soon be open for settlement and development. The land, however, was already occupied, namely by the many Iroquois and other native tribes who had fought alongside the British during the war. To avoid any incidents, King George III issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which forbade any settlement west of a line drawn along the Appalachian Mountains, known as the Proclamation Line. Effectively, the British had created an Indian reserve to the west of the Appalachians and east of the Mississippi. This did not sit well with American colonists, who felt that they had fought the French and Indian War to gain access to this land. Naturally, many ignored the proclamation and settled west, increasing tension between themselves and the natives. Much to the dismay of British colonial authorities, relations between the British government and the American colonists became increasingly strained through the 1760s as Great Britain attempted to regain control of their economy. The 7 Years' War had grown from a territorial dispute into a full-fledged global conflict, with a cost to go with it. To pay off the war debt, the British Parliament levied a series of acts and taxes against the colonies in order to try and regain their lost financial footing. The colonists, who viewed themselves as loyal subjects to the British Crown, became increasingly agitated. It was not that the taxes were exorbitantly high. In fact, they were quite low, and often the measures taken by the British government were taken to lower the cost of British goods and raise the costs of those being sold by their French or Dutch competitors. For the colonists, the heart of the issue was not the cost, but rather the lack of consultation before levying the acts and taxes. As British subjects, the colonists believed they had all of the rights and liberties of any British citizen, which included representation. The British government argued that the colonists were represented virtually, and that the Parliament acted in their best interests. Many Americans did not agree, and resentment began to grow. The rallying cry became, "No taxation without representation." As more and more colonists began to view King George III as a tyrant, and the British Parliament as an aggressor toward them. Great Britain had always regulated the economies of its respective colonies through acts and laws passed by Parliament through the last century. These laws had only been loosely enforced, as the economic gains of the American colonies also benefit Great Britain. As the 1760s began, however, Britain needed to regain control of the financial situation, sparking animosity from the colonists, who had long appreciated their free economic relationship, and raising questions on the constitutional rights of the American colonists. In 1764, the Sugar Act was imposed to regulate the amount of French and Dutch sugar and molasses being imported to the colonies, in favor of sugar and molasses being sold by the British East India Company, while it lowered the cost of sugar from the East India Company. Colonists saw the act as a violation of their rights to trade and conduct business. Colonists protested the Sugar Act by boycotting British goods affected by the act. While this form of protest was not widely successful, from an economic standpoint, the East India Company had one of its best years. In 1774, the protest was noted by British Parliament and many Whigs within the British government warned that relations could worsen if some sort of agreement could not be met. The following year, in 1765, the Parliament passed the Stamp Act. It was the first act of Parliament ever directed specifically at the colonies, as opposed to across the empire. The Stamp Act would require any form of official paper to need an official stamp. The act affected newspapers, almanacs, and official documents such as licenses, deeds, and wills. It even meant that playing cards required the official stamp. Such a direct tax had never been levied against the colonists, and many saw it as an attack by the Parliament in response to the boycotts the year before. Secret organizations known as the Sons of Liberty began to appear throughout the colonies and threatened violence on anyone who sold the stamps. Indeed, violence began to break out across the region as the Sons of Liberty targeted British officials who enforced the act. In one such case, the home of Lieutenant Governor of the province of Massachusetts Bay and Chief Justice Thomas Hutchinson was ransacked by an angry mob, allied by the Sons of Liberty. While Hutchinson and his family escaped the violence, their home was destroyed. Some colonists, however, did not act out in violence, but relied instead on a united political action. 9 colonies sent representatives to the Stamp Act, Congress in New York City, and compiled a Declaration of Rights and Grievances. For the British Parliament, the Declaration stated the position of many of the American colonists, stating that the British taxes, levied without representation, violated their rights as not only British subjects, but as men. Again, the Americans engaged in protest by boycott, this time with significant results. The income from imports to the American colonies fell from £2,250,000 in 1764 to £1.944 million in 1765. In England, American statesman Benjamin Franklin argued the case of the American colonies to Parliament and warned that continued abuse of the colonists could and would result in rebellion. Fortunately for the colonies, the Parliament experienced a shift in government, which had sympathy for Whig politics, which resulted in the repeal of the Stamp Act. The Parliament passed the Declaratory Act in 1766, reversing the Stamp Act, but at the same time insisting that the Parliament, as a legislative body, had the right and power to make laws for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Both sides viewed the result as a political victory, believing that their interpretation of the rights of the colonists had been heard and secured. The Parliament believed it had exerted its will as the governing body of the colonies, once and for all, had established their right to levy laws on them. And the Americans believed that the British Parliament would not ever directly tax them again without some form of representation. A door had been left open, and if the British government was not careful, it might be able to close again. In 1767, things were still not going well. Economically for the British,